So, King Charles may have just made one of the most quietly dramatic moves of his entire reign, and almost nobody noticed it happening. There were no cameras, no breaking news alerts, no palace press release, no official announcement afterward. Instead, the story centers on a private gathering inside one of Britain's historic royal rooms, where a second crown was reportedly positioned beside the throne. And what allegedly happened next left everyone in the room completely speechless. Because if these reports are accurate, Charles wasn't simply making a decision about the future of the succession. He was making a statement about who he believes can help carry the monarchy forward right now. And surprisingly, the person at the center of that decision wasn't William, it was Catherine. Before we get into everything that reportedly happened, if you're new to Hollywood today, this is where we break down the biggest royal stories as they unfold. So take a second to subscribe. It only takes a moment, and it really does help the channel. Now, let's get into what supposedly happened behind those closed doors. According to the reports, the gathering took place quietly inside one of Britain's old royal rooms. And honestly, the secrecy surrounding the meeting may be the most intriguing part of the entire story. There was no advance warning sent to broadcasters. No tabloids were reportedly given early notice. The palace didn't issue a statement afterward. And perhaps most unusually, the exact date and time of the gathering were never revealed. That is not normally how the modern monarchy handles important royal events. Even relatively minor engagements can receive press advisories well ahead of time. Schedules are often carefully coordinated, photographers are informed, and the public is usually given at least some indication that something is taking place. So the absence of all of that raises an obvious question. Why was this kept so private? The answer, according to the story, is that Charles wanted this to be personal rather than performative. He reportedly asked a carefully selected group of people to attend. Senior members of the royal family were there. Constitutional advisors were present. Palace officials with decades of experience were also reportedly in the room. And yet, according to the account, none of them knew exactly what they were about to witness. Catherine arrived without the usual spectacle surrounding a senior royal appearance. There were no photographers waiting outside. No press cameras captured her arrival. She simply entered quietly, carrying herself with the calm, controlled presence that has increasingly become associated with her public image. The interesting part is that nobody could apparently tell what she was feeling. Was she nervous? Was she uncertain? Or was she simply completely composed? Then Charles entered. And according to those described as being present, the atmosphere inside the room immediately changed. One account compared the feeling to the stillness that comes just before a storm. That strange, heavy silence when everyone senses that something important is about to happen, even though nobody knows exactly what it will be. Charles reportedly stood at the front of the room for what seemed like an unusually long moment. Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. And then he turned his attention toward Catherine. He looked directly at her. And slowly, he began moving in her direction. But this is where the story takes an especially unusual turn, because sitting beside the throne was reportedly a second crown, and that is not something you would normally expect to see simply placed there without explanation. A crown isn't just another royal decoration. Within the monarchy, it carries enormous symbolic and constitutional significance. So why was there another one in the room? That question reportedly left even some of the people present confused. The senior royals didn't appear to have an explanation. Palace staff apparently weren't expecting it. And even constitutional experts in attendance reportedly couldn't immediately explain why it had been placed there. If that's accurate, it suggests this wasn't simply part of a standard, prearranged royal ceremony. It was something Charles had chosen to do himself. And then came another detail that reportedly caught everyone's attention. Charles rose slowly. Very slowly. Multiple accounts described him as moving at a pace that seemed noticeably more deliberate than usual. And that detail is important. Because this didn't sound like an impulsive decision made in a sudden burst of emotion. It sounded calculated, measured, intentional. Charles knew what he wanted to communicate, and he wasn't rushing through it. He reportedly reached for the crown. Then he turned toward Catherine, and instead of placing it on her head as would happen during a formal coronation, the account says he placed it on her shoulders, for all time. That's the phrase being associated with the moment. And the distinction between placing a crown on someone's head and placing it on their shoulders is significant within the story. The symbolism isn't necessarily about crowning her. It's about placing weight upon her, responsibility, duty, leadership. And when that happened, the room reportedly fell completely silent. There was no applause, no celebration, no dramatic reaction, just silence. because everyone there supposedly understood that they had witnessed something deeply unusual, something that wasn't expected to happen in that room on that day in that particular way. Now, before this sounds like nothing more than an elaborate piece of royal drama, there is some important context surrounding Charles himself. King Charles publicly revealed his cancer diagnosis in February 2024, with Buckingham Palace confirming that he had been diagnosed with an unspecified form of cancer. During the early stages of his treatment, he stepped back from some public duties. But that didn't mean he stopped working altogether. Behind the scenes, Charles continued with the constitutional responsibilities that rarely make headlines. Documents still needed to be dealt with. Briefings continued. Important meetings still took place, and the business of the monarchy carried on even while his health was being treated. Then, in December 2025, Charles appeared in a video message for Channel 4's Stand Up to Cancer campaign. This time, he spoke directly from the perspective of someone whose life had been affected by cancer. During the message, he said his treatment was moving into what his medical team described as a cautious phase. He referred to that development as a significant milestone. But there was another moment that people noticed. Charles paused. Not just briefly, but for several extended seconds. Those watching picked up on it. It created the impression that he was carefully considering every word before continuing, almost as if there was something else he wanted to communicate but couldn't quite bring himself to say. And when you place that health timeline beside the reported private gathering, the situation starts to look very different. Charles is not stepping away from the monarchy. He continues to carry out engagements. He continues meeting with world leaders and heads of state. He continues maintaining a demanding schedule. So this isn't necessarily a story about Charles preparing to disappear from public life. It's about something more practical. Every monarch eventually has to think about what they are leaving behind. Every reign has to confront the question of continuity. And Charles, more than most, understands that decisions made today can shape the monarchy long after today's headlines have disappeared. That may be why the reported moment with Catherine matters so much. Because if the account is accurate, Charles wasn't simply thinking about succession. He was identifying who he believes can carry the emotional weight of the institution forward. And that distinction may be the part everyone else is overlooking. The question isn't simply who comes next. The bigger question is who can hold the monarchy together in the present moment. And according to this extraordinary account, Charles may have given Catherine an answer. The legal order of succession hasn't changed. William remains the heir to the throne. Prince George remains next in line after him. No law has been rewritten. No constitutional document has suddenly been amended. Nothing about the official succession has been altered. But here's where the story gets much more interesting. Because the influence of the monarchy isn't based entirely on what is written in legal documents. It also depends on something far less tangible and sometimes far more powerful: visibility, connection, and whether ordinary people actually feel that the institution represents them. And that's where Catherine appears to have achieved something that very few other members of the royal family have been able to reproduce. To understand why Charles would reportedly make such a significant move toward Catherine, you have to understand what she herself has experienced. Because her own journey changed the way millions of people saw her. In March 2024, Catherine announced that she had been diagnosed with cancer. She didn't make the announcement from some elaborate palace setting. Instead, she appeared seated in a garden in Windsor, dressed simply in a striped shirt, and spoke directly to the public about undergoing preventive chemotherapy. There was no elaborate production surrounding the message, no attempt to turn the announcement into a polished royal spectacle. It was simply Catherine speaking openly about something deeply frightening happening in her life. And the public reaction changed almost immediately. For roughly 15 years, Catherine had lived under an extraordinary level of public scrutiny. Her clothes were analyzed. Her body language was examined. Her expressions were discussed. Even the smallest details of her appearances could become headlines. But suddenly, the tone changed. The tabloids didn't completely stop watching her, of course, but the intensity noticeably softened. Online comments became more sympathetic. And people who had never been particularly interested in the royal family suddenly found themselves genuinely concerned about Catherine, not because she was a future queen, not because she held a royal title, but because she was a mother with 3 young children confronting the same terrifying possibility that countless families around the world have faced. That made the story deeply personal. She completed her chemotherapy in September 2024, but her return to public life wasn't rushed. Instead, it happened gradually. Her appearances were carefully chosen. Rather than simply filling the royal calendar with endless engagements, she focused on events that appeared meaningful and important to her. Then came another major moment. In January 2026, Catherine confirmed that she was in remission. Just 2 words, but they carried an enormous emotional weight. The relief wasn't limited to Britain. People around the world had followed her absence. They had watched her step away from public life. They had watched the uncertainty surrounding her health. And then they watched her begin returning. That entire journey changed something about how the public perceived her. It made Catherine feel human in a way that traditional royal duties never could. Not manufactured, not carefully constructed. Human. There is one particular moment from early 2026 that continues to circulate online and helps explain that shift in public perception. Catherine was visiting Evelina London Children's Hospital when a 10-year-old girl named Adrian reportedly asked her if she was the queen. Catherine paused. She smiled. And rather than responding with some formal explanation about titles, succession, and constitutional procedure, she reportedly answered in a warm and natural way. That tiny interaction said something much bigger about how children, and perhaps the wider public, see her. The little girl wasn't trying to make a constitutional argument. She wasn't studying the line of succession. She simply looked at Catherine and saw someone who seemed important enough to be the person in charge. Someone who mattered. And that is exactly the kind of perception Charles may now be trying to formalize. Because when you understand the British constitutional system, this becomes even more interesting. The United Kingdom doesn't operate under one single written constitutional document. Instead, its constitutional framework has developed through legislation, court decisions, conventions, traditions, and centuries of established practice. That gives the system a certain flexibility. Institutions can evolve without necessarily rewriting the entire legal structure. So, if Charles really did elevate Catherine's role through a private ceremony, that wouldn't automatically mean he had changed the succession. William would still be the heir. George would still be next after William. The legal framework would remain intact. What could change, however, is public perception. And that may be considerably more important than it first sounds. Because when an institution depends heavily on public recognition, visibility, and emotional connection, perception becomes a form of influence all by itself. Queen Elizabeth understood that better than almost anyone. Her authority wasn't based on controlling Parliament. Her strength came from becoming such a consistent and recognizable symbol of the country that, for generations, it was difficult for many people to imagine Britain without her. When she died at Balmoral in September 2022, the monarchy didn't simply lose its sovereign. It lost one of its most powerful emotional anchors. And ever since, the institution has had to confront the question of what could possibly fill that enormous space. Charles inherited that challenge. And he also inherited a health situation that forced him to think about the future and his legacy perhaps earlier than he had expected. Look at public sentiment during 2024 and 2025, and a pattern begins to emerge. Charles has earned respect. Camilla has gradually established greater acceptance. William has built trust. But Catherine has something different. She has affection. And those aren't necessarily the same thing. People can respect a king. They can trust a future king. But love creates an entirely different relationship between a public figure and the public. That is part of what people often describe when they talk about the so-called Kate effect. It's not simply about clothing. It's not merely about a dress selling out after Catherine wears it. The deeper issue is influence. When Catherine speaks, people pay attention. When she appears publicly, people gather. And when she went through a health crisis, the public response wasn't limited to polite sympathy. Millions of people seemed emotionally invested in seeing her recover. That kind of connection is incredibly valuable to an institution whose survival depends partly on public support. And that's why comparisons with Diana continue to surface. But Catherine's relationship with the public is built on something very different. Diana's extraordinary connection with people was partly rooted in her complicated position inside the royal system. She was perceived by many as an outsider, someone who could challenge the institution from within. Catherine represents another kind of story, resilience. She is inside the system. She has lived within its expectations. She has been scrutinized by it. She has endured one of the most frightening personal challenges imaginable while remaining connected to the institution. And then she came back. That matters. Because people don't simply admire Catherine. Increasingly, they trust her. And then there is another development that adds an entirely different dimension to her position. There were reports that in 2026, Catherine became the first Princess of Wales in 11-16 years to grant royal warrants. If accurate, that is a significant responsibility. Royal warrants aren't simply ceremonial pieces of paper. They represent official royal recognition of businesses and suppliers, and they can carry considerable prestige and economic value. The last time a Princess of Wales reportedly exercised this particular authority was during Queen Mary's era. So think about what that means. Catherine hasn't become queen. She isn't changing the line of succession. She isn't replacing William. And yet she's being entrusted with responsibilities traditionally associated with much higher levels of royal authority. That tells you something about how the palace may be viewing her role. She isn't simply standing somewhere in the background waiting for her turn. She may already be becoming one of the central pillars of the institution. And if Charles really did make the reported move behind closed doors, perhaps that is the message he wanted everyone in that room to understand. Catherine isn't waiting in the wings. She's not simply preparing for a future role. She's already functioning as one of the central figures within the institution. And according to sources described as being close to the palace, that reality was discussed long before this reported private ceremony ever took place. In the months leading up to the gathering, Charles, William, and senior constitutional advisors reportedly held a series of private conversations. Some of those discussions allegedly took place at Highgrove and Buckingham Palace. And according to those sources, the subject wasn't medical succession planning. Those arrangements are handled through separate processes. Instead, these conversations were reportedly focused on something much broader: the future image of the monarchy, how the institution would remain relevant, how it would maintain public confidence, and perhaps most importantly, who could help connect the royal family with a public that is changing rapidly. Catherine's name reportedly came up again and again. Not because anyone was challenging William's eventual position. Nobody was suggesting that Catherine should somehow replace him. Rather, the discussions reportedly recognized that she brings something different to the monarchy, something the institution badly needs. She feels approachable. She can connect with people without appearing distant. And that quality is increasingly valuable for a royal family trying to remain relevant in the modern era. The palace has also reportedly been very deliberate about the way Catherine's responsibilities have expanded. Take her role as Colonel of the Irish Guards. In 2026, she led the St. Patrick's Day event at Mons Barracks in Aldershot, where she demonstrated not only warmth toward those taking part, but also a strong understanding of the traditions surrounding the occasion. That might look like just another royal engagement if you aren't paying attention. But these appearances aren't necessarily random. They're individual pieces of a much larger picture. Every new responsibility, every public appearance, every title, every increasingly important assignment. Together, they suggest a gradual expansion of Catherine's position within the monarchy. And all of it may have been leading toward one larger message. Charles could look at Catherine and effectively say, "This is the person who can help carry the monarchy's relevance into the next generation." And perhaps that's why the private nature of this reported ceremony is the detail that matters most. Think about it. If Charles wanted to make an official constitutional change, he couldn't simply do it in a quiet room with a handful of people. There would be established procedures. There would be public announcements. There would be government involvement. There would almost certainly be traditional ceremony and formal documentation. And if his goal were to send a direct political message to the government, there would be official channels for doing exactly that. But that's not what reportedly happened. Instead, he chose a private setting, a small group, and a deeply personal gesture. That's not how you rewrite a law. It's how you influence a narrative. The message wasn't necessarily intended for the entire country at that exact moment. It was for the people sitting in that room, the advisors, the officials, the senior royals, the people who may spend decades helping guide the monarchy alongside William and Catherine. Charles was reportedly making it clear that the future of the institution wasn't just about a line on a succession chart. It was about who could embody that institution in the eyes of the public. And in this story, that person was Catherine. There's actually something very traditional about that approach. For all the modern technology, constant news coverage, and social media surrounding the monarchy today, some of its most consequential decisions have historically been made away from the cameras. Queen Elizabeth understood that principle exceptionally well. Her reign was built around consistency, restraint, careful preparation. She rarely needed dramatic public declarations to demonstrate the strength of the institution. Instead, she understood that the monarchy's influence often came from appearing stable even when circumstances around it were anything but stable. Charles appears to be following a similar instinct. Rather than creating a massive public spectacle, he reportedly made a statement privately to the people whose opinions and advice would matter most. Then, from there, the message could gradually move outward through the palace's communications network. And the reported reaction in Britain followed an interesting pattern. First, silence, then relief. Because for many people, this didn't necessarily feel like a shocking transformation. It felt like confirmation of something they already believed. Catherine has arguably been functioning as the monarchy's emotional center for years. She's the person many people look toward when they want to feel positively about the institution. She's capable of walking into a room, interacting with people, and creating an atmosphere that feels calmer and more reassuring. And that isn't something a public relations team can simply manufacture. You can't write a media strategy that automatically gives someone genuine emotional credibility. Either people connect with you or they don't. Catherine's health journey may have demonstrated that connection more clearly than any royal campaign ever could. When she announced her diagnosis, she didn't appear to turn the situation into a publicity opportunity. She didn't try to transform the announcement into a sympathy campaign. She simply explained what was happening and stepped away from public life so she could concentrate on her health and her family. That straightforwardness mattered. It gave people a reason to believe her. So when she later announced that she was in remission, the public response carried genuine emotion. And when she gradually returned to public duties, people celebrated that return. Why? Because by that point, the relationship had changed. People weren't simply watching a royal. They had watched someone go through something difficult. They had seen vulnerability. They had seen uncertainty. And then they saw resilience. That kind of trust isn't created by carefully managed photographs or perfectly written palace statements. It comes from experiencing something difficult and allowing people to see the human being behind the title. Charles witnessed that journey from an unusually personal perspective. Because while Catherine was going through cancer treatment, Charles was dealing with his own cancer diagnosis and treatment. He knew what she was experiencing because he was experiencing his own version of it. He saw the pressure, the uncertainty, the physical and emotional strain. And he also saw the way Catherine handled it, with restraint, with dignity, and with a sense of calm that may have reminded him of someone very important from his own life. His mother, Queen Elizabeth. She had a remarkable ability to project calm when circumstances were anything but calm. Even when the future was uncertain, she could make people feel that the institution remained steady. According to this account, Charles may have recognized a similar quality in Catherine. And if he did, it makes the reported decision easier to understand. Because qualities like that are difficult to teach. They're even harder to manufacture. And from Charles's perspective, they may be too valuable to leave unrecognized. So what does all of this actually mean for the future of the monarchy? Legally, the answer remains exactly the same. William will become king. After William, George remains next in line. The succession itself continues according to the established rules that have governed the monarchy for generations. Nothing in this reported ceremony changes that. But here's the crucial distinction. The survival of the monarchy isn't determined solely by who inherits the crown. It's determined by whether the institution remains relevant, whether people still care, whether they still feel connected to it, and whether they believe the monarchy has a meaningful place in their lives. That's where Catherine becomes so important. She isn't simply a future queen waiting for her turn. In this narrative, she's already functioning as a leader. She's helping make the monarchy feel more accessible, more human, and perhaps more connected to ordinary people. That may be exactly what the institution needs as it moves into a very different era. One senior government official was reportedly said to have described the development as a necessary and timely modernization of the monarchy. Another political observer reportedly argued that one of the monarchy's greatest strengths is its ability to bring people together when society is divided. And Catherine may be uniquely suited to that role. She's not viewed as aggressively political. She's not inherently polarizing. She doesn't appear to seek controversy. Instead, her public image is built around something much simpler: consistency. And after years of political turbulence, economic uncertainty, and the disruption caused by a global pandemic, that kind of steadiness can become incredibly powerful. Charles understands that. He's now had enough time on the throne to recognize that being king isn't simply about signing documents, attending ceremonies, and carrying out constitutional duties. It's also about symbolism. It's about what people see when they look at the institution. And perhaps most importantly, it's about whether they still believe that institution represents something worth holding on to. And perhaps that's the reality every monarch eventually has to confront. If you can't personally become the symbol people need, then the next best thing is recognizing who can and giving that person the space and responsibility to become it. And according to this account, that's exactly what the private ceremony accomplished. It wasn't about Charles preparing to step away. It wasn't about William somehow being pushed aside. And it wasn't about changing the legal order of succession. It was about Charles looking at the person he believed could help carry the monarchy into its next chapter and making a decision. The person he reportedly chose was Catherine. And perhaps the most striking part is that there were no cameras there to capture it, no reporters waiting outside, no public announcement designed to generate headlines. That secrecy arguably makes the moment more significant rather than less. Because if Charles wasn't performing for the cameras, then the gesture wasn't about winning public approval in that instant. It was about making a decision inside the institution itself. And the people who were reportedly present, the senior royals, constitutional advisors, and experienced palace officials, would have witnessed it firsthand. They would remember the moment, they would remember the silence. And, according to the story, they would remember that when Charles had to identify the person he believed could carry the monarchy's emotional leadership forward, he didn't hesitate. He pointed toward Catherine. And when you step back and connect all the pieces, the story begins to form a much larger picture. The health crisis, the extraordinary public reaction, Catherine's gradual return, her expanding responsibilities, the preparation behind the scenes, and finally, this alleged private ceremony. Taken together, it doesn't look like a random gesture. It looks like the culmination of years of watching, evaluating, and preparing. Charles watched Catherine face something terrifying. He watched her step away from public life. He watched her fight through treatment. And then he watched her return with a renewed connection to the public. He saw something happen that traditional royal duties couldn't create on their own. People became emotionally invested in her. They weren't simply interested in what Catherine wore or where she appeared. They cared about whether she was okay. They wanted to see her recover. They celebrated when she came back. And Charles would have seen all of that while dealing with his own health challenges. He also watched Catherine take on more responsibilities within the monarchy. She was given increasingly prominent roles. She reportedly took on responsibilities connected to royal warrants. She continued appearing at important military and ceremonial events. She spent time supporting children and families in hospital settings. And every one of those appearances added another piece to the larger picture. Catherine was no longer simply the woman waiting to become queen one day. She was already demonstrating the qualities expected of someone who could represent the institution at its most human level. And that's where the question of legacy becomes impossible to ignore. Every monarch eventually has to ask the same basic questions. What did I build? What did I protect? And what will remain after I'm gone? Charles hasn't had the longest reign, and his health challenges have forced him to confront those questions earlier than he might once have expected. But perhaps those challenges also gave him a clearer understanding of what actually matters. The laws can remain unchanged. The succession can continue exactly as established. William can still become king. George can still follow him. None of that needs to change. But there is another reality that no constitutional document can guarantee. People have to continue believing that the monarchy matters. They have to feel connected to it. They have to see something of themselves reflected in the people representing it. Without that connection, legal succession alone cannot guarantee the institution's future relevance. And this is where Catherine becomes so important to the story, because Catherine appears to make people believe. She gives them someone they can relate to, someone who has experienced fear, uncertainty, family pressure, public scrutiny, and a devastating health crisis, and still managed to return. That may be the deeper meaning behind the second crown. It wasn't necessarily a transfer of legal authority. It was a symbolic transfer of emotional responsibility. Charles was effectively saying, this person has demonstrated that she can carry the weight, not simply because of the family she was born into, not simply because of the title she holds, but because she has been tested. She has endured something incredibly difficult, and she came through it. The public saw that journey. They responded to it, and they formed a connection with her because of it. That's a very different kind of authority. It's not written into constitutional law. It can't be handed over through a formal document. It's earned. And perhaps that's why one small moment at a children's hospital carries so much significance when viewed alongside everything else. A young girl looked at Catherine and asked if she was the queen. On the surface, it sounds like an innocent mistake. But maybe it wasn't really about understanding the line of succession at all. Maybe the child was simply recognizing the person she instinctively saw as important. The person who seemed to represent leadership. The person who seemed to matter. And if the reported private ceremony actually happened as described, perhaps Charles saw that same reality from inside the institution. The constitutional experts could explain who was legally next. The succession rules could identify who would eventually wear the crown. But Charles may have been looking at something different. He was looking at who already had the emotional connection necessary to carry the monarchy forward. And according to this story, his answer was Catherine. She isn't simply waiting for the day when she officially becomes queen. She's already becoming one of the institution's most important figures. And Charles may have just made sure that the people whose decisions will shape the monarchy for decades understand exactly how he sees her role. because sometimes the most consequential royal decisions aren't announced from a balcony. They aren't made beneath flashing cameras. And they don't always arrive with a formal statement from the palace. Sometimes they happen quietly, behind closed doors, in a room where only a handful of people are present. And sometimes one symbolic gesture is enough to communicate an entire vision for the future. If that is what Charles intended with the second crown, then the message was remarkably simple. The succession hasn't changed. William hasn't been replaced. But the emotional center of the monarchy may already have shifted, and Catherine may not be waiting to become the leader people believe in. According to this extraordinary account, she already is.